The first bills that we're going to look at are 5744, 5890, 5943, 5999, and 6000. All of these bills are bills that are being supported by the Board of Elections, and Bob Raposa from the Board of Elections is kind enough to stay late at work today to give a brief introduction and summary for all 5 of these bills and entertain questions that members of the committee might have. Is Mr. Raposa on the line?
Hello, Chair.
Good afternoon, Bob. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. We're here discussing the 5 bills put forth by the Board of Elections: 5744, 5890, 5943, 5999, and 6000. You have the floor to introduce them. I'd ask that you go through them one at a time and then pause so that committee members may ask any questions that they might have.
Okay. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. The first House bill is 5744. It is a change being requested by the board for the nomination of party and independent candidates. It actually affects 3 different sections of Rhode Island general law. The first section that it requests a change to is 1714.8. It allows the voters to endorse nomination of candidacy documents by either mail, email, or facsimile, and delivered to the Board of Canvassers in person via email, mail, or facsimile. It also establishes the standards in which these documents should be received by the Board of Canvassers. The second section is the affidavit of the person obtaining the signatures. It includes an attestation regarding the collections of signatures electronically if it is applicable. And the last section of state law that would be affected is 1714.11, which is the checking and certification of nomination papers to a challenge. This act would allow nomination of candidacy documents to be delivered from candidates to the Board of Canvassers in person, mail, email, or facsimile by the deadline. This procedure was used in preparation of declaration of candidacy in June, at what point these candidates were allowed to fax in their nomination papers to the Board of Canvassers prior to the deadline. It worked very well. I will say it was not used extensively by candidates, but it was a nice option in which some did utilize. The board valued the way that this could work, and they voted 7-0 in support to introduce this legislation to you this year for consideration. Does any of the members have any questions of me regarding House Bill 5744?
Second Vice Chair Corvese.
Good afternoon, Bob.
Good afternoon.
Haven't talked to you in a while.
It's been a long time.
First, let me just say that the Board of Elections does an exemplary job, and they have done an exemplary job, especially during the pandemic. I'd also like to thank you for all the time you take to answer all our questions, especially mine. With regard to the bill before us, 5744, I had mentioned to you that with regard to email and fax, both of those documents have a time on them. Am I correct?
That is correct.
Would the time on the fax and or the email be the time stamp that would be used by the Board of Elections, the official time stamp?
That would actually be the time used by the Board of Canvassers.
I'm sorry, the Board of Canvassers. Okay.
Your answer is, yeah, you are correct. That would be the time the Board of Canvassers would use as a submission.
So it would not be, let's say, a time after that per review of the document. It would be the time that the document came over the electronic media.
That is correct.
Thank you, Bob.
Representative Knight.
Thank you. Hi, Bob. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. I want to second Chair Corvasi's compliments on the past year and all the work that you guys did to make our elections run so smoothly. I just have a question about. I love this idea that we're trying to enable electronic signatures. It seems a little unwieldy in that we're bending the statute to the form as it exists today. The form is today a 2-page form, and I see that the draft statute in front of us contemplates sending both sides of the paper to the signer, and then having the signer send both sides back to us, or back to the candidate, or to the board. Is there a reason why we can't just simplify the form and get it down to 1 page, or better yet, contemplate in the statute an electronic signature service, because they are becoming used more and more? I could certainly see a time when you could gather signatures by sending a request for an electronic signature and then submitting that to the board with the audit trail from the signing service.
I understand what you're saying. Where I can't speak on behalf of the board, I believe what you said has a lot of merit, and that is something that we definitely could bring back before the board for them to discuss. I believe that the reason it was done in the manner that it was presented to you is to keep somewhat consistency with how we have done the filing of these documents in the past.
I hear that, and I acknowledge that sort of building in statutory language for a document signing service at this point might be a big egg to swallow, because I think there's probably a lot of questions there. But at the very least, I would suggest to you and to the sponsor is that we could make this a whole lot simpler and with a whole lot less chance for error if we had maybe perhaps a separate endorse or signature form for use with electronic signatures, where it's just a 1-pager PDF of some kind that you send out, get someone to sign and send back. Because if we got to mess with, I'll tell you what, in this last year, I looked at the temporary procedures that were put out by the Board of Elections for this electronic gathering of signatures, and it was so unwieldy with the 2 pages, I just said, I did not use it. I went out and got them the old-fashioned way, social distance with a mask and a lot of hand sanitizer, because I saw all the chances for error. So if we could even get it down to 1 page, that would be great.
Thank you.
Representative Corvasi has another question for you, Bob.
With all due respect to my colleague, Representative Knight, I like the 2-page. I think you should have consistency. I think it should remain that way. And when I was getting signatures, I did not have a problem at all in the middle of the pandemic doing it the old-fashioned way, just for the record.
All right, Bob. Oh, Representative Newberry has a question for you as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have strong feelings one way or the other about this particular bill, but I do have a question, Bob. What was the discussion at the Board of Elections about this? And the reason I ask is I understand during the pandemic things were in flux. Hopefully that'll be the last time we have to deal with this kind of thing. I also didn't bother with any of this. I had no trouble getting signatures, but this seems to make the process more complicated than it needs to be. I mean, we've had some discussions on the House floor in the past on unrelated issues about signatures, even last year. Getting signatures for most candidates, or any candidate really, is not that hard, the old-fashioned way. Why does the board want to change it and maybe complicate the process? That's my question. What's the rationale for why we need to do this?
I don't believe it is to make the process more complicated or difficult. I believe that the rationale behind it was to use the avenues that we have available to us to facilitate the receiving of the nomination papers to the local boards of canvassers due to any type of difficulty that may occur. I do know in the past sometimes the nomination papers, the candidate has difficulty getting them to the local board of canvassers by the deadline, where if they have them, they can get their documents to the local board of canvassers, because the law would still require that the originals are received by the local board of canvassers. I believe it's just our board was looking at it as an option to work or assist the candidates in getting this to their local board of canvassers.
I guess my only comment to the room, but also to the chair. I mean, you and I are both attorneys. We know electronic everything is sort of the wave of the future. I get all that, but sometimes getting 50 or 100 signatures and turning the actual paper in, it's just not that hard. I think this is going to make it more complicated. Is my general feeling on this. But
Any further questions? Representative McGaugh.
I have one question, just to clarify, and I want to thank Representative Knight for his suggestion. I do think it can be cumbersome for people who are submitting the paperwork, when you send them out the forms and they have to send them back. But just a quick clarification on the bill itself. It does provide some option for voters to turn the paperwork in directly to the Board of Canvassers. Also stated in the bill, it says that if a candidate turns it in, the 2 pages they cannot be stapled together, that they have to be made a double-sided page. But it doesn't say that specifically to voters that are turning it in, and so I just want to clarify if that same requirement would apply to voters turning them in directly into the Board of Canvassers.
Yes, I believe that is the intent. It would be consistent.
Any further questions for Mr. Raposa on House Bill 5744? Okay, Bob, you can move on to 5890.
House Bill 5890 is a piece of legislation that changes 2 existing state laws. The first one that would be changed is 17-2010, which is the certification of applications, issuance of ballots, marking of lists, and the mailing address. Currently, the state law states that when the local boards of canvassers receives a mail ballot application from the voter, when they certify the signature so that the voter would receive a ballot, they must do so by using the hard copy voter registration form that they have on hand. This law would change the option that they can then, in place of, as an option, they could use the statewide central voter registration system, which also has the signature of the voter scanned into the voter's record. It would assist the local boards of canvassers when they are certifying the signatures of the voters. The second section of the law is 17-2026, which is the opening and counting of ballots. Currently, the law states that we can begin processing mail ballots 14 days prior. We would like the opportunity to change that to 20 days, which was done by an executive order last year for the 2020 elections. And due to the increase in number of mail ballots that we had, the 6-day change was a tremendous benefit to the Board of Elections. Prior to the 2020 elections, we had, as a reference, for the presidential election in 2016, we received 45,000 mail ballots. In 2020, for the presidential election, which is similar races on the ballot, we received over 170,000 mail ballots. By allowing us to begin 6 days earlier, provides us to be better prepared after the close of the polls to be able to present our results to the electorate of the state of Rhode Island. Now, this also will give the board the opportunity that right now the state law says that we have to put the announcements of our certifications in the newspapers of general circulation. Newspapers in general, the circulation has been reduced due to the increase of availability of websites, email, the board is recommending that we be able to email or a change that could be made to this legislation could be telephone, where the candidates are aware that we are doing mail ballot certification when it is expected to begin, and for approximately how long. This way here that we are notifying the candidates, the public, the media, that we are doing certification. And that is the two changes that is part of House Bill 5890.
Second Vice Chair Corvesi has a question for you, Bob.
Bob, not so much a question, but a number of comments. First of all, I want to thank you. I asked you to walk me through this, and you did an excellent job leading me down the appropriate path. I think this is a good bill. I think this will help the Board of the Board of Elections. I'm glad to see that you would be amenable, or the board would be amenable to changing under 17-2026 if it could be telephone or email in case those candidates do not have an email. And I think that the 20 days, I think, is important for a greater efficiency on the part of the Board of Elections. I think I think that's a good idea. As far as having the city or town Board of Canvassers have the option of the CVRS system for the signature, I think that's a good idea. So I would like to see that if this bill goes forward, Mr. Chairman, with the consent of the committee, I would like to see telephone placed back in there, or email, or an and, or whatever, so that just in case there are those candidates who don't have an email, and if anyone's wondering, I actually do have an email, but I very rarely use it.
Does it come to your flip phone?
You'll pay for that around 11 o'clock tonight. Remember that. And yes, I do, and it does not come to my flip phone.
Okay.
Nope.
Representative Knight.
I'll note for the record that flip phones are coming back. They're cool now. Bob, hey, I just have a question and a suggestion. CVRS database as a term, if we're going to write it into statute, perhaps we should define it. Or maybe change that language to say a system approved by the Board of Elections, which contains, just so you're not locked into using CVRS forever without a legislative change. And the other thing is, and this is my question, why, I see the section where we're changing the beginning of the count from 14 days prior to 20, but why not just open it up? Isn't it easier for the Board of Elections to count ballots as they come in?
Well, the way that we process ballots at the Board of Elections, we'd like to have a minimum of 5,000 ballots, because then it makes the process continue to be smoother than just open 500 ballots or 1,000 ballots. We like a substantial amount, and usually we do not have a volume of ballots 20 days prior. That's when we start to bulk up with our receipt of ballots.
Okay, so it's neither here nor there. 20 days is going to help you, but earlier is not going to help you anymore.
It wouldn't help us or hurt us now.
Okay, thanks.
Representative Agelo.
Thank you, Chairman Shanley. On page 4 of this bill, there's new language regarding the certification of the signature. First with 2 persons reviewing and comparing, and then going on to supervisors and kind of up the chain. That's new language, isn't it?
That is new language, Rep, that we actually used but via executive order for 2020 elections, September, November, and March. This allowed us to do the certifications and also use the new piece of voting of equipment that we purchased with federal funds during the month of August. This is a change. What this does is it adds validity, in the board's opinion, to the certification process, because we have teams of people working together to review the signature on the oath envelope with the signature that is maintained in the central voter registration system or the database that we would be using at the time, which I like that suggestion, by the way. And when the first team of people review the signatures, if they believe it's a match, the ballot goes forward into the process of being opened and counted. If the first team does not agree with the certification, it goes to another set of reviewers. If the second set of reviewers believe it should be counted, again, that ballot goes forward. If the second team of reviewers believe it does not need to go forward at that point, then the executive order and the suggested law change will allow us to review the voter's driver's license, social security, or state identification number, which is optional on the envelope, but if it is there, it gives us another avenue to go to look to compare the signature or the identity with the voter to the oath envelope. Another avenue that we have that this law follows is that if there is still some disagreement in the certification of the oath envelope to the signature on file, the law would allow us to review the mail ballot application that the voter completed when they asked the Board of Canvassers to send them a mail ballot. That research is done, as I stated earlier, by the local Board of Canvassers at the time the ballot has been requested. So that signature on the application has been verified by the local Board of Canvassers. So as you can see, there are many sets of eyes that are looking on these ballots for this certification. Now, if at the end of everything that just has occurred that I just explained, and there still is not an agreement that the signatures match, the voter is then sent a discrepancy letter in which they have 3 days after a primary to return it to the Board of Elections, or 7 days after an election to provide the information that we have requested. After the 3 days or 7 days, depending if it's a primary or an election, the board will hold a meeting, and any outstanding ballots that have not been rectified, the board reviews the oath envelope and the documentation that we have, and they make the final determination whether or not the ballot should be counted or voided.
Representative Agelo?
Thank you. I have two follow-up questions. I'm curious as to the number of signatures that were not accepted, and so the voter was invited to come in and cure that discrepancy. And then beyond that, the number of that maybe the voter didn't respond.
I can tell you that for the most recent election, which we conducted on March 2nd, there were 72 envelopes that were questioned to the discrepancy process. 71 of them, the voter never signed the oath envelope in which they sealed their ballot. So the board made the motion that those were to be voided. There was no way for us to compare the signature with the signature on file because there was no signature on the old envelope. There was one ballot that went before the board, and an example would be that on the old envelope, the name of the voter was printed. But when we reviewed that signature, that printing on the old envelope, the voter signed their application. The voter's signature was on record as being a registered voter in the state of Rhode Island. That voter did not respond to our discrepancy. The board voted to void that ballot because it was a printed name compared to a signature.
Any further questions for Bob? Representative Corvesi.
Bob, to sort of dovetail onto what my colleague, Representative Knight, had said, I feel much better having a clearly delineated time factor or time where these ballots will be counted, so that we have a reasonable expectation of what's going on, as opposed to something that's going on willy-nilly. Not to say that anything down at the Board of Elections is, but I think that there are certain expectations with the electoral process that we have to know exactly what's going on and how it's going to proceed. And that philosophy, I think, is going to follow in all the bills that we have before us with regard to the electoral process tonight. Second thing is this. I support the bill, obviously, but I just want to point out, and you know, you walked Representative Agelo through the process as you did myself. Keep in mind that, and this is not a knock on the process, keep in mind that there is a human factor in the process. Whenever you have a human factor, you have to keep an eye on things. Okay? And that's just in general in anything. Okay? And again, I've already stated my respect for you and the Board of Elections, but there are some things here that are perfunctory, that are electronic, and there are some things that require human supervision. And whenever there's human supervision, we have to keep a tight rein on things. And I thank you for all your help.
You're very welcome.
Any further questions on 5890? Representative Tanzi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Raposa. And if you don't have these numbers in front of you now, if you could just send them to the committee, that would be wonderful. I'm wondering, you gave us the number of ballots that were questioned and not cured for March. If you could provide those numbers for November and September as well, that would be greatly appreciated.
I would be pleased to do so.
Okay, Bob, I think we can move on to 5943.
House Bill 5943 is a housekeeping bill. This is a bill that, in the board's opinion, should have been repealed many years ago when the Help America Vote Act, which was a federal act that came into being state law after the 2000 elections, and that the federal government made voting more accessible to the voters. 1729, as I stated, has been part of state law since 1978 and has not received any changes. When the Help America Vote Act came into being in 2002, the state of Rhode Island in 2003 enacted Rhode Island General Law 17-1924, which would allow the voter to cast a provisional ballot at the polling place. And Title 17, Chapter 20 relates to mail ballots. And 17-20-29 states that if a voter requested a mail ballot and they did not vote it, this is just a summary, that they had the right 3 days before to surrender their ballot and go at the Board of Canvassers and have their name restored onto the voting list, so on Election Day they could go into the polling place and cast a ballot. With the creation of the provisional law by the General Assembly in 2003-17-1924 and the HAVA Act, it changed the way that this would occur. And one of the reasons when you went into a polling place, just a quick summary, was as soon as a voter requests a mail ballot, that person is locked out of being able to vote at the polling place on Election Day. The poll pads or the poll books prior to the poll pads would indicate the voter has requested a mail ballot. So they cannot vote. They cannot receive a ballot from our election officials, vote, and cast it into a machine. But they do have the opportunity to cast a provisional ballot. One of the categories of a provisional ballot is the voter signs an application attesting to the fact that they requested a mail ballot, they did not vote it, and now they are doing a provisional ballot. After the election, the provisional ballots go back to the Board of Canvassers. The Board of Canvassers will certify and process all provisional ballots 2 days after the election. And the reason we have 2 days is that, especially in 2020, with the introduction of drop boxes, we make sure all of the ballots that have been placed into the drop boxes and any ballot that we have in this building by 8 p.m. on Election Day is accounted for, which will tell the local Board of Canvassers when they go to certify 2 days after the election, when they look at the voter's record, if it states that the ballot has not been received, the local Board of Canvassers will certify that provisional ballot, instructing the Board of Elections to count the ballot when it's delivered to us. When the local Board of Canvassers looks at the central voter registration system, and if they see that the voter has received their mail ballot at the Board of Elections, there's a date received in the field, that ballot will be disqualified by the Board of Canvassers. But that gives you the background on this, but 172029, in the Board's opinion, should be repealed because it is no longer effective, and it actually works not in tandem with 1924 in the HAVA Act.
Any questions from members of the committee?
Let me,
Check with
Bob.
Vice Chair Cortese.
Bob, I sponsored this bill, and again, I wouldn't sponsor a bill unless I really thought that it was necessary. This is a cleanup bill, as you said, and I think that this is probably an easy one.
Thank you.
Any other questions from members of the committee on 5943? There are no additional witnesses signed up on that bill, so that will conclude testimony on 5943. Bob, if you want to move next to 5999.
5999 is a bill that we now are submitting for the fourth time to the General Assembly. The first 2 years that we introduced it, both times it did pass the House. Last year when it was introduced, obviously it didn't pass due to the pandemic. But this is a bill that is extremely important in the sense that it has to do with write-in candidacy. Right now a voter can just write in Bulldog, Mickey Mouse, Joe Schmidt, anybody's name that they so choose. After the election, the state board is required to work in tandem with the local Board of Canvassers to tally all of these write-ins that are received for every single race that was on the ballot in all 39 communities. There has not been an election in a long time in which a write-in candidate won the race. This law would require 1714-18, which is the Declaration of Intent for Write-in Candidacy. It would require a potential write-in candidate to file with the Secretary of State by Friday, the day before the Tuesday election, that they wish to be considered a write-in candidate for whatever race is on the ballot that they are eligible to run for to be a write-in. After the election, when the results come in, see, and by doing that, you would limit the number of write-ins, and that's where you will eliminate the Mickey Mouse, the Donald Duck. And at the end of the election, there is a large time factor that comes into effect, because we are required by 17-1931, which is the irregular ballots, which says that the candidate was not on the ballot as a candidate, so they are a write-in. And then 1722-7, which is the book of records that the Board of Elections is required to produce after every general election year. When we go and, let's just say, use an example of governor. When we tally all the write-ins for the governor, we tally all the write-ins from all the mail ballots that we received. The local boards of canvassers are required to tally all the ballots that they have received for governor at the polling place, and then they are also now required to tally all these results from write-in ballots that have been cast during the 20-day emergency period. They then tabulate both of the polling place and emergency ballot reports for us for all the ballots, votes cast on the ballots for a write-in. They send this to the Board of Elections, where we then have to merge all of these results with the results that we have received from mail ballots. And the reason being is, in Barrington, we'll use that as an example, they have Precinct 0101. Precinct 0101 has mail ballots, emergency ballots, and polling place ballots. We have to merge those results 3 down to 1. The 3 down to 1 happens here at the Board of Elections. As of February 28th, we concluded the tallying of the write-in ballots for the November general election. I had 4 seasonal people here 35 hours a week tallying these numbers. You would still get the results. It would tell you how many ballots were cast for a write-in when you look at our summary report. But to go to the detail of exactly who received the ballots doesn't provide any information, because there wasn't one person that received write-in votes that won the race. There is a big time factor in the tally and the cost of being able to merge and tally all these results together.
Representative Newberry has a question for you.
It's not really a question, it's more a comment on the bill. First of all, I will preface this by saying that I am someone who has written in candidates on occasion on the ballot, not in Rhode Island to my knowledge. I lived in a one-party city in another state, and I had 2 successive congressmen end up in jail. So I did not know they were criminals before I didn't vote for them, but I didn't write in Mickey Mouse, I don't think, but I do respect the write-in vote as a way of protest when there's no other choice in the ballot. I don't want to minimize it too much. But that said, I appreciate the problem the board has, but look, it's unlikely a write-in candidate's going to win. But my town, for example, we have town council elections. It's 5 spots on the ballot. It's town-wide. What if, and we had the 2014 election, we only had 5 people run. What if a month before the election, one of those 5 people was found, was arrested for child molestation or something like that? You would have a write-in candidate most likely win. I don't know who, What would happen if a write-in candidate who failed to follow this procedure won an election? I mean, it is conceivable, if highly unlikely, and that's my concern. I don't know how the board would address that.
1931, it says that the ballots voted for any office in which no eligible candidate appears on the ballot for that office or in any other office, they would have to file this declaration with the Secretary of State. If there was no other, I understand what you're saying. We maybe should have a caveat that says that if there is not enough candidates, like in your case, that then obviously a write-in candidate is going to win one of your town council seats.
No, but I'm not suggesting there is. I'm talking about there's 5 candidates on the ballot. After they're qualified to be on the ballot, there's some huge scandal in a small town that impacts one of those candidates to the point that in a town where, 4,000 people might vote, that person's not going to get the votes. There should be some caveat in here that if somebody wins, they win, whether they filed a thing or not. I mean, what do you do if someone wins an election and they didn't follow the procedure? That's my point. It can theoretically happen. There's got to be something in here to change that.
I agree with that. And the way I understand what you just stated is feasible. That if you have 5 declared candidates, something happens to one of them, then obviously a write-in is going to win that one of those seats. And they should be allowed to do so. I agree with that. So that could be something that we could word differently in this legislation.
It's funny. One of my compatriots just texted me and reminded me of a situation where that exact happened in the neighborhood, the other town I represent, Overhaul, years ago. So it can happen.
Mm-hmm.
Any further questions for Mr. Raposa on 5999? Bob, you want to go to 6000?
6000 is the Board of Elections.
While you're going to that, Chairman Corvasi has a question for you.
Mr. Bob, I'm sorry to do this. Could we briefly go back to 5890, Representative Chairman Shanley's bill that he put in for the Board of Elections? There was a very important piece there that I wanted to bring up, probably the second most important thing I wanted to say tonight on these bills. And I had my notes and I couldn't find out where it was. Do you have 5980 in front of you?
I have it right in front of me.
What is it?
5890.
5890. Okay, maybe that's why I couldn't find it. You have it, Bob?
I have it.
On page 4, and I mentioned this to you, and I'd like the board to consider it, and I'd certainly like this committee to consider it. On page 4, lines 22 to 32, they have been deleted, and a more general two-sentence explanation has been included. And I understand what the board wants to do here, okay? And I mentioned that to you. And I like the fact that the challenges would be made to the executive director of the board or the executive director's designee, and the decision would be the subject to the review of the board. The difference between lines 22 and 32 and lines 32 and 34 is that basically you've compressed all that and you're going to establish guidelines, quote unquote. I would prefer to see lines 22 and 32 retained because they delineate the process, what to expect. But I also don't have a problem with, so I would leave 22 and 32 in. I would take the sentence that begins on 32, the board shall establish, and that ends on 34. Okay, take that out, and I would leave the last sentence, because in that one sentence, you're trying to, you're going to establish guidelines, but I would much prefer that those guidelines be delineated in the bill, where we can see what the process is going to be, and it's extremely transparent, and I don't think anybody would have a problem with that process if you read it. So we keep it in, and then that sentence that begins on 34 with regard to the challenges, who they're going to be made to and who it's subject to review, I have no problem keeping that. But I think that, I think we should keep that in there. And I think the committee should consider keeping that in there.
Okay.
All right, Bob, do you want to go on to 6,000?
6,000 is the board's big bill for 2021. It actually changes 11 different citations within Rhode Island general law, all within the mail ballot certification, mail ballot, and it has to do with the removal of the witness and the notary requirement that is currently in place in the state of Rhode Island. If I could, just 1 second. I need to get one thing. So the first section that is affected is voting by mail 1721. This change would remove the language referencing a person voting by mail only if they are unable to vote in person. The second section that would be amended would be Declaration of Policy, which is 1721.1. This act would establish that a voter may elect to vote by mail whether they are able to vote at the polls or not. Third, requirement for validity of mail ballot and mail ballot application, 1722.1. This act would remove the requirement for a voter to have his or her signature on his or her mail ballot certification envelope be witnessed or notarized. The next, requirement for validity of emergency mail ballot, 1722.2. Again, mirrors 1722.1, where it would be the removal of the signature on his or her emergency mail ballot certificate envelope to be witnessed and notarized. The next, the alternative methods of voting by citizens covered by the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, UOCAVA, 1726.1, would remove language referencing the lack of a requirement for a voter to have his or her signature on his or her mail ballot certificate envelope to be witnessed and notarized due to the proposal to have this requirement be removed for all voters. The next, voting from Board of Canvassers, 1720.14.2, would remove the requirement for a voter to have his or her signature on his or her mail ballot certificate envelope executed at the Board of Canvassers, witnessed or notarized. The next, certifying envelope, 1720.21. This act would modify the oath on the mail ballot certificate envelope for the voter to attest he or she has not and will not vote elsewhere in the election. It would remove the requirement for a voter to have his or her signature on his or her mail ballot certificate envelope witnessed or notarized. The next, certificate envelopes for mail ballots of persons intimately connected with a military service and persons employed outside of the United States, 1720.22. This act would modify the oath on the mail ballot certificate envelope for the voter to attest he or she has not and will not vote elsewhere in the election. The next would be the marking and certification of ballot, 1720.23. This act would remove the requirement for a voter to have his or her signature on his or her mail ballot certificate envelope to be witnessed or notarized. The next, irregularities in obtaining and casting mail ballots, 1720.24.1. This act would remove language referencing a requirement for a voter to have his or her signature on his or her mail ballot certificate envelope to be witnessed or notarized. And lastly, penalties for violations, 1720.30. This act would remove language referencing a requirement for a voter to have his or her signature on his or her mail ballot certificate envelope to be witnessed or notarized. All these changes eliminate the witness and notary from what we refer to as the oath envelope or the certificate envelope. This was done by executive order during the 2020 elections, and it had a benefit in the board's opinion because it allowed a voter to cast their ballot, sign the oath envelope, and return it back to the Board of Elections without having to locate either two witnesses to witness the voter's signature or the notary to witness the voter's signature, because it is a hardship in some cases, be it pandemic or not, to be able to get people to witness or notarize your oath envelope. I know there has been questions and concerns of maybe fraud, but there is also the concern that if somebody were to fraudulently sign an oath envelope, how do we know that the witness or notary also is not a fraud? Now, the way that we are proposing to do mail ballot certification, which I explained during a previous bill, 172026, I have teams of people here. So there are many people's eyes that are looking at these return envelopes to qualify that the signature on the oath envelope is in fact the signature of the voter. And if at the end of our very strong, thorough review, it is determined that there still remains a question, we send a letter to the voter asking them to repair or correct their deficiency. It is also should be noted, I did some research today, there are 11 states in the United States that still require a witness or notary. The state of Rhode Island is one of them. The other states no longer or have not required a witness or notary on their oath envelopes, and that we have several states in the country that are entire mail ballot states. The voter does not have a polling place option to cast a ballot, and those are in Colorado, Oregon, Washington State, and they have not had issues of fraud where voters, due to this issue of not having a witness or notary on the oath envelope. The board, I would like to mention that on these 5 bills that I have discussed with you this afternoon, all 7 of these bills received support from the board of the Board of Elections with a 7-0 vote. The board strongly recommends or hopes that you consider these bills to change the existing state law to make and then continue to improve the efficiency of elections in the state of Rhode Island.
Representative Tansey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Raposa, should Bill 5890 not pass, would you want to add the lines that you just discussed, clarifying the signature matching process? Those are on page 4, lines 1 through 20.
Could you explain that again? Run over that one more
Sure.
time with me. 5890.
Right. So Chairman Shanley's bill, it delineates the process of signature matching
Correct.
and then the hierarchy. Should that bill not pass, would it be beneficial to include it in this bill should this one pass and the other one not pass? I'd like to not lose that hierarchy and have those assurances that the signatures that are on the envelope are still being matched. I don't want to lose that safeguard that you've been doing should one of the bills not pass.
I agree. We don't either. So if that were to become a requirement, I can't speak for the board, but I would definitely agree with your opinion that these should be merged.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Corvesi?
Bob,
Yeah.
you know how I feel about this bill. The reason why notaries and signatures were used was an additional level of protection against fraud. And I'm not going to ask you to ask this because it's probably more of a rhetorical question, but I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion behind the scenes on this. What has changed in the human condition that we no longer need that protection? So, we're going to have to consider that. And I thank you for your efforts.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Representative Knight and then Representative Tansey again.
Hi, Bob.
Hi.
So I want to sort of pull back to the 50,000 foot view and look at this bill. Essentially what we're doing is getting rid of the notary requirement prior to the submission of a mail ballot, right?
That would be correct. It would be on the envelope.
Okay, and we're doing that because in the Board of Elections you have a signature verification system that's all ready to go, so you can do the signature comparison in-house, right?
We actually were able to purchase a very sophisticated piece of equipment in August with federal funds that helps us to process mail ballots. The system that we have does not have the component to do an automatic signature comparison between the oath envelope and what we have in the central voter registration system. That is still a manual effort. We still have humans reviewing the oath envelope with the signature in the central voter registration system. But the equipment that we have is highly technological in the fact that I'll give you a quick, the first time the ballot goes through the machine, and it goes through from Barrington to Woonsocket, and how we receive it goes in the machine, it goes through. On the envelope there is a barcode, and the machine picks up the barcode. It then populates the central voter registration system, which ultimately populates the websites maintained by the Board of Elections and the Secretary of State's office. So that allows a voter to go onto the website to find out if, in fact, their ballot has been received by the Board of Elections.
I appreciate that. What I'm asking is, and I'm just, like I said, I'm just trying, for the viewers at home, I'm trying to make it clear to them, and maybe you can confirm this for me. There is a signature verification system in-house at the Board of Elections, right?
That is correct.
Okay, so I'm looking at the law, the law as it stands now, 1720-21. It was created in 1978. It's been modified several times. The last time was 2013. But I think my understanding is that whereas the notary requirement certainly is a signature verification system back in the day, if we keep it in place now, we're essentially having two, right? We're having the voter verify their own signature against a notary, and we have the Board of Elections in-house system. So this bill would basically get rid of the burden on the voter, and our security would be assured because we have that system in-house.
That is correct.
Thanks, Bob.
Representative Tansey?
Thank you. And Mr. Raposa, do you check the validity of the signatures other than the voter? Do you have a system to check the witnesses or the notaries?
We do not have a method to verify the witness.
So it's a burden without a purpose.
It's the witness, when they sign that oath envelope, they sign their name and the town in which they live in, but that is all that we have. The notary, we do have a way to check the notary when we can refer the notary, if the notary especially gives us their notary number, with the state of Rhode Island notary system.
You can, but you don't, correct?
We have in the past.
But not as a regular practice of the 74,000 ballots or the 170,000 ballots that you got by mail. It is not a regular practice to check the notary or the witnesses.
That is correct.
Okay. So you have a very comprehensive system to check the voters. And if we eliminate the other three signatures, actually doesn't provide any true safeguards. It's just a burden for the voter, is my assessment.
And in my opinion, and that this, I will not speak for the board, that the system that we have in place with the human factor of teams working together, they are verifying that that signature of the voter is the signature that is on the oath envelope that has also been signed by the voter. And through all the steps, as I've mentioned during this afternoon's discussion, there are many different people that look at the validity of the signature on the two devices, the oath envelope and the central voter registration system, or if we ever get to the ballot application.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raposa. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Corvese.
Hopefully my last comment on this bill. With regard to my colleague, Representative Knight, I realize that lawyers are words are very important in the profession of lawyers. And we have a system, Representative Knight mentioned a system, a verification system. We have a verification process. Systems sometimes will give the impression that everything is automated, technological, etc. But we do have that human factor. So we have a process in place, but we don't necessarily have a flawless system.
Any further questions or observations for Mr. Raposa? Okay, thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Everyone have a good afternoon. Thank you on behalf of the board for listening to our testimony.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll move to Rob Rock.
So I can move on to House Bill 5890?
Yes, that actually concludes testimony on House Bill 5640 in general, so you can move on to 5890.
Okay, great. And thank you, Chairman Shanley, for introducing this legislation. Our office is responsible for sending all mail ballots to voters, and we usually send mail ballots out about 30 days before the election. In the 4 elections over the last 10 months, our drop box outside our office, I know many across the state did as well, saw a very heavy activity in the first few days after voters received their mail ballots, which means people were voting them rather quickly and getting them back. Our office also allows voters to track their mail ballots on our Voter Information Center website. Voters can see when we mailed their ballot. They can see when their voted ballot was received by the Board of Elections and when their voted ballot has been accepted by the Board of Elections. So by allowing the Board of Elections to begin processing mail ballots on the 20th day before an election will allow us to update our website in a timelier manner so voters will feel comfortable knowing that their ballot was received. And I know that Representative Knight early on in the hearing mentioned about extending beyond 20 days perhaps. And I believe that voters, most voters will receive their mail ballots about 29, 28, 27 days before the election and turn them back right away. So even extending it beyond 20 days, I think, would be a good thing to give the Board of Elections as much time as possible to open and certify mail ballots. That way voters know that their ballots have been received by the Board of Elections and are in the process of being counted. And that's my testimony on 5890. Should I go on to House Bill 6000?
Yes, that concludes testimony on 5890, so we can move on to 600. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, sir. And thank you to Representative Tanzi for introducing this legislation on behalf of the Board of Elections. Last year, the issue of requiring 2 witnesses or a notary to cast a mail ballot was fought all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In 2020 and in 2021, this March elections were all conducted without voters needing to find a notary or 2 witnesses for their mail ballots. More than 350,000 people in Rhode Island voted by mail in 2020 and in 2021 in the 4 elections combined, without witnesses or notaries and with 0 allegations of voter fraud. We believe that voters should be allowed to cast a mail ballot without the need for anyone's assistance because it is a more secure method to conduct mail ballot voting. It is also consistent with the process used in most other states across the country where signature verification is the validation process for mail ballots. In fact, Rhode Island is one of only two states along with Alabama, that requires 2 witnesses or a notary public to vote by mail. So we urge support of House Bill 6000.
Thank you. That will conclude testimony on House Bill 6000. If you would like to move on to 5983.
Sure thing. Okay, so thank you, Chairman, and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak in support of House Bill 5983. I would also like to thank Majority Whip Kazarian for introducing this legislation that would provide voters the opportunity to remove from the Constitution the requirement to be registered 30 days before an election to be able to vote in Rhode Island. The requirement to register 30 days prior to an election means Rhode Island shares a place with several other states as the earliest voter registration deadline in the country. And so we have made progress over the past 6 years improving access to the ballot box while securing the integrity of every vote. So this is important at a time when we see some states working to restrict voting options for their citizens. We think it's important to expand them here in Rhode Island. Rhode Island must continue to be a leader in the voting access and legislation. This legislation keeps us moving forward. Online voter registration and automated voter registration modernized how Rhode Islanders registered to vote. The acquisition of new voting equipment and the introduction of electronic poll books have streamlined the check-in process and voting process altogether. And providing voters with the opportunity to remove the 30-day voter registration deadline from the Constitution builds on all this work that we've accomplished along with the General Assembly. States that have same-day voter registration typically show a higher turnout than non-same-day states. 21 states and the District of Columbia have same-day registration, including all New England states, with the exception of us and Massachusetts. As I mentioned earlier, we have made incredible progress improving the administration of elections. We've revised our laws to better reflect today's technology and systems to improve the voting experience and streamline our processes. With the election system we have today, there is no reason why we cannot securely introduce same-day registration here in Rhode Island. And keep in mind, this proposal would not only allow new voters to register closer to Election Day, but it would also ensure that current voters who simply forgot to update their address or correct their registration information would be able to vote closer to election as well. We must look no further than this past election cycle to see how voters respond when they're provided with convenient methods to vote. In November, we had a record turnout, and these ballots were cast almost equally, divided among the three safe and secure voting methods, early, in person, by mail, and at a polling place on Election Day. So placing this constitutional amendment on the ballot would provide voters with the opportunity to have Rhode Island join the majority of our neighboring New England states in enacting same-day voter registration. Thank you for your time, and I asked support of House Bill 5983.
Rob, Chairman Corvese has a question for you.
Good evening, Rob.
Yes,
How
sir.
are you?
Good, sir. How you doing?
I know you're representing the Secretary of State this evening.
Yes, sir.
So basically, the Secretary of State's office feels that residency plays no requirement regarding legitimacy for voting.
No, residency would be a requirement. It's just that voters would be able to register to vote on the same day as casting a ballot. So, for example, if somebody either forgot to register to vote or has moved to Rhode Island within 30 days of an election, we still believe they have the right to cast their ballot here in Rhode Island.
But I thought that bill would get rid of the 30-day requirement for residency.
Right, but they would still have to live in Rhode Island to vote here. So if they just moved here, or if they
for 1 day.
Well, yes, if this is where they live, we believe that the voters should be able to vote here.
Oh, okay,
yes.
Fine. But what you're saying is they can't live. It has to be basically same day. They can just move in the same day and vote.
If they establish residency in Rhode Island before Election Day, yes, they should be able to vote.
And if you take the 30 days out, logic would dictate that they can move into a particular community the same day and vote.
Yes.
But they can do that. Okay. Not very logical. Thank you.
Representative Tanzi has a question as well.
Thank you, Chairman Shanley. Mr. Rock, don't they have to have a Rhode Island form of ID in order to vote and access the ballot? So while they may not have registered, they would have to have something that shows that they have met at least a residency requirement in order to be a Rhode Island voter?
Well, this would be so. This bill would ask the voters to remove the 30-day requirement from the Rhode Island Constitution. there's a state law that's still on the books that says that voters have to register to vote 30 days before an election. So we just want to take this out of the Constitution and make it fall in the state law. But there is a photo ID requirement in Rhode Island currently, which would still be in place if this bill were to pass and the General Assembly were to act on the 30-day residency requirement in the general laws, not in the Constitution.
Okay, so the goal is to remove this as a constitutional limitation so that the General Assembly has the ability to create laws guiding it.
That's correct. There is a state law that still says you have to register to vote 30 days before the election. We just feel like this is not something that should be in the Constitution, and we do feel, to Representative Corvasi's point, that we do feel, though, that same-day registration is something that's good for the state of Rhode Island. So on top of removing it from the Constitution, we'd hope that the General Assembly would also allow for same-day registration.
I support same-day registration, but I want to make the distinction that there are other laws that would preclude someone from moving from another state the day before the election, or just walking over the border and saying, I live here now, and being able to vote. There are other requirements that are in statute now that prevent someone from doing that.
Right, so there are residency requirements in the law. I believe it's 1713 defines what residency is, and it's being your fixed domicile, essentially where you rest your head at night.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Mr. Rock? Okay. Rob, are there any other bills that you had signed up to testify on that we did not get to discuss with you?
Yes, I believe it's House Bill 5745.
Okay, you have the floor on that.
Thank you, sir. And I would also like to thank Representative Agelo for introducing this legislation. The bill makes important and necessary changes to our election laws. First, the bill removes the two witnesses and/or notary requirement to vote by mail, and then also expands the permanent mail ballot list. And the third proposal establishes an online mechanism to request mail ballots, and lastly, formalizes the early voting process. Last year, and again, we already talked about the two witnesses and notary, but it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and many people voted in Rhode Island without that witness and notary requirement in 2020 with no issues. And then as far as expanding the permanent mail ballot list, it does make it easier for voters to cast ballots safely from home if they choose. More voters are casting ballots by mail, a trend that we saw even before 2020. We saw mail ballots increase since the law passed in 2011. And we should provide them opportunity if they choose to continue voting in this way as easy as possible. Another part of the proposal would direct our office to develop an online mail ballot application. Right now, voters must submit a physical application, but the online system could establish a similar to the online voter registration system that we have that was approved by the General Assembly in 2016. We've got the capability to streamline this process, making it more convenient for voters to request a mail ballot and for election administrators to process those applications. And then the final aspect of this legislation is an issue that we've been advocating for quite some time, and that the legislature instituted early voting last year, and voters overwhelmingly showed their support for early voting, particularly in November election, where more than 149,000 people cast their ballots in their city or town halls in advance of Election Day. However, we believe that the legislature should go a step further and use the specific term early in-person voting as opposed to emergency voting, so there's no confusion for voters and election administrators. As I said, right now the process is known as emergency voting, which does, I believe, cause confusion for many voters who thought they'd have an actual emergency to vote in this way. Voters turned out in record numbers last November, and almost equally, again, whether it was in person before Election Day, by mail, or in person on Election Day. We believe that we need to continue our efforts to ensure Rhode Island voters can cast their ballots securely and conveniently in whatever manner they choose, and we support the passage of House Bill 5745.
Representative Corvasi has another question for you, Rob.
Rob, I'm glad you made the distinction, because the Secretary of State keeps saying that we have early voting in this state. We don't have early voting in this state. We do not have early voting on the books. We have emergency voting. And one of the reasons why you had an increase in individuals voting in advance of the primary and Election Day was because of the pandemic. Let's not forget that. We have no early voting. but we do have emergency voting.
Yeah, and we do believe that voters are going to continue to vote early. I mean, we just want to make it as easy as possible and as convenient as possible. We know today that to have voters vote on, one 13-hour day every other year on a Tuesday is just not the way that we live our lives today. People are busy, have a lot going on, and we feel that if we can allow people to vote on the few weeks before Election Day, including weekends, we want to give people the most opportunity they can to cast a ballot in today's busy world. So we believe that the numbers of emergency or early voting are going to continue to increase whether we do have a pandemic or not, because we feel like voters really like the fact that they've got a convenient way to cast a ballot, whether we send a mail ballot to their kitchen table or they have the ability to go to their city or town hall on the second Tuesday before Election Day. We feel like it's important to expand those options for our Rhode Island voters.
Any further questions for Mr. Rock? Okay, thank you very much, Rob.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, so let's move on to House Bill 5999 from Representative Agelo. Bob Raposa from the Board of Elections spoke about this a couple of hours ago. We have Steve Brown and Galen Hour signed up to testify on the bill. While we're doing that, House Bill 5743 from Representative Batista, Steve Brown is also signed up on that, so I'd like to take his testimony, if he's available now, on both of those bills, as well as any other bills that he signed up on for tonight. Is Mr. Brown available? Good evening, Steve. Evan Shanley from the House Committee on State Government and Elections. How are you?
I'm fine, Chair. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. We're going to try and take your testimony on a few different pieces of legislation that you've signed up on tonight, beginning with House Bill 5999 from Representative Agelo. You are signed up in opposition, and you have the floor. Please keep your testimony to 2 minutes or less.
Thank you very much. The ACLU is in opposition to this legislation, which deals with write-in voting. You heard testimony on this earlier. Our position is that a voter is making a statement by deciding to cast a write-in vote, and therefore it should be counted. We know that it's not necessarily the most efficient thing to be counting votes, many of which may seem trivial or votes for feudal candidates, but they're votes. We grow up being told that in a democratic society, every vote counts. Passage of this bill would literally mean that some votes don't count. And so for that reason, we believe that it's appropriate for the Board of Elections to count any vote that's been cast, even if it may seem like a throwaway vote. And so we hope that the committee will not pass this legislation.
Any questions for Mr. Brown on 5999? Ms. Steve, if you want to testify on 5743 from Representative Batista.
Yes, so this is another Board of Elections bill, but it was one that I did not hear Mr. Raposa explain earlier on when he was talking about all the other Board of Election bills. We are opposed to this legislation. We think that it would have a very significant adverse impact on nonprofit organizations throughout the state. It's very technical, but what it essentially does is combine various statutes dealing with campaign finance reporting, and in doing so, it changes the status of nonprofit organizations, and particularly 501c3s, and what their obligations are when they participate in ballot advocacy campaigns as opposed to candidate campaigns. It would impose a number of reporting requirements that don't currently exist. The other thing it would do is it would subject these organizations to reporting requirements if they engage in anything that's called electioneering communication. But an electioneering communication, as defined in the statute, means that if a charitable organization publishes a newsletter, and in the newsletter it mentions a piece of legislation and who sponsored it, within the time frame, within 60 days of a general election, and they mail it out to, I think it's more than 2,000 people, that organization will now have to report that newsletter mailing to the Board of Elections or else face sanctions. So we urge the committee to look at this bill very seriously. It may look like it's just making some technical changes, but we believe it would really have a very hard impact on literally hundreds of nonprofit organizations across Rhode Island. With that, again, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Brown? Okay. Steve, are there any other bills that you're signed up on to testify tonight that you have not already testified regarding?
No, those are the only ones. If I could just say, though, there are a lot of other election bills you've heard that we support. The two-witness repeal, we actually filed the lawsuit dealing with that issue. I didn't want to spend a lot of time. You've heard great testimony on those, but we have submitted written testimony on them.
Thank you. Next, we will move to Galen Hour. Did. And after Galen, we're going to be going back to some of the other Board of Elections bills, looking for Armando Battistini on House Bill 5744, then John Marion on House Bill 5745, and then Jeff Taylor on House Bill 5738. Good evening again, Galen. How are you?
Good. Hello. So again, I am here testifying on behalf of the Alliance of Rhode Island Southeast Asians for Education in opposition to Bill 5999. So the Rhode Island Constitution, we feel, creates, an inequitable barrier to running for office for individuals who have recently served or are currently serving a sentence after being convicted of a crime. And while we recognize that this bill doesn't, it's not adding to those barriers, this isn't addressing the issues in the Constitution, but it does further codify those barriers in Rhode Island law by explicitly requiring write-in candidates to certify that they're not currently and have not in the last 3 years served a criminal sentence. And for that reason, Arise opposes this bill. The barriers that I'm talking about disproportionately impact people of color who are incarcerated at higher rates than the general population because of the systemic racism that we know forms really the foundation of our criminal justice system. And I want to just take this opportunity to acknowledge two other bills that are on the agenda, which are Bill 5749 and Bill 5750, which would prohibit private prisons in our state. Arise is not giving verbal testimony on those bills tonight, but stands in solidarity with our partner organizations in the community who have been championing this issue. And I just want to close by reminding the committee that in this country, an election is not merely a multiple choice poll to find out who won. It's, in the words of the late John Lewis, an almost sacred right through which we express our dissent. And it's the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in a democratic society. So Arise believes that it's the responsibility of the Board of Elections to record the results of all elections in a way that accurately and completely reflects the will of all voters as expressed through the ballot, and that must include a record of all write-in votes. Unfortunately, even the ones that might seem like a joke, regardless of whether or not a candidate receives enough write-in votes to influence the ultimate outcome of the election. With that, I'll thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Galen? That will conclude testimony on House Bill 5999. Next, we'll move back to House Bill 5744, and we have Armando Battistini available from the ACLU of Rhode Island. Good evening, Armando. How are you?
Good evening. I'm well, thank you.
We're here discussing House Bill 5744, sponsored by Representative Batista, and you are signed up in support. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you, and thank you to the committee members for hearing from me this evening. I am appearing on behalf of the American Civil Liberties Union of Rhode Island, with respect to House Bill 5744, and the Rhode Island ACLU supports the aims of that bill, and specifically codifying remote collection of signatures as part of the ballot nomination process makes good sense for two reasons. First, the remote collection of signatures avoids needlessly exposing candidates, their supporters, and the general public to risks associated with person-to-person contact with no justifiable countervailing government interest. And the experiences of the 2020 election bear this out. During that election, I represented the ACLU and 5 candidates in a successful lawsuit wherein we had the federal court order that the state should accept remote signatures. And I want to highlight those candidates because they tell the tale. 2 of those candidates had respiratory ailments that required that each of them limit their exposure to persons outside their respective homes, and another candidate was the mother of 4 children, one of whom had a medical condition that made him acutely at risk if exposed to communicable diseases. I think it's important to emphasize that none of these risks were unique to COVID, but that all of these persons had issues related to exposure that were obviated by the use of remote signatures, so that while it's convenient and in fact perhaps easy for those of us in good health, collecting signatures does pose a risk for those who have health issues. The second reason why it's a good idea is technology has now progressed to the point where the requirements of in-person signature collection is antiquated. The current ballot nomination process requires in-person solicitation and receipt of signatures that we no longer have to do. And we know that because in 2020, many candidates partook of remote signature collection. That went very well, and our State Board of Elections, Secretary of State, and local Board of Canvassers did their usual great job in sorting through, collecting, and then reviewing those signatures without the sort of complications that certain persons had expressed some concerns about earlier tonight. So we've already done this, it works, and it's a good thing. Now, that said, we do have some recommendations relative to the specific bill. We suggest that the bill as drafted is overly complicated and agree with Representative Knight on this point. We respectfully suggest that there are some uncomplicated alternatives that might be superior. First would be that candidates be allowed to solicit and receive signatures via email or other electronic means, and that the candidates then provide an S/S e-signature for any person who has authorized the execution of the petition on his and her behalf, along with all the other required information, including the address of the petition. Candidates should also be allowed to submit nomination papers via email, as ostensibly all of the local boards have emails and the ability to print email attachments. We also think that dispensing with the submission of the second of the 2 nomination pages makes a lot of sense because it would just ease the ability of candidates and the general public to submit these rather than dealing with regulations like double-sided copies versus stapling. We believe that the modified process that we're presenting would present little burden on the local boards. The review process of the petitions remains essentially the same. The board would compare the name and address with the roll of eligible voters in the district and determine whether to allow or disallow the signature. The only difference would be that certain signatures would be e-signatures. To ensure that the e-signatures have been properly authorized, the candidate should maintain a hard copy of the email or other electronic communication with the person authorizing that signature. If the signature is challenged, the candidate should be required to produce that authorization. With that, we thank you for your time, unless anyone has questions.
Any questions for Mr. Battistini? Thank you very much. That will conclude testimony on House Bill 5744. Next, we're going to take up 2 bills from Representative Phillips, House Bill 5729 and 5742. Representative Phillips is here with us in person, and you have the floor whenever you're ready, Representative.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for hearing my bills early. I have another committee meeting to have more bills heard, so I appreciate your thoughtfulness on me. We'll start with H5729. Both these bills I have submitted in the past. Last year, nothing happened because of COVID. The year before, we've had some lively discussions, and it's gotten some, the first one, 5729, has gotten some good press on it. Because one of the concerns that I would tend to think most of us, if not all of us, have had is people saying that we get one good year out of you, we're being elected every 2 years, we get one good year out of you, and then you're on re-election mode and you get nothing done. So I said that why don't we look for 4-year terms? We have 4-year terms in other states. We have 4-year terms for our general officers, the governor, lieutenant governor, etc. So, but this is the difference of this bill with a lot of the other bills. I wanted to make sure that we did not lose our institutional knowledge at one point if we turned over more than, like 50% or 75% of the people in the legislature. So what I did is I broke it down, and we still have elections every 2 years. The even number House numbers, same with the Senate, would be 1 2-year cycle, and the odd numbers would be the opposite 2-year cycle. The reason why we still have 2-year elections would be because we have 2-year elections for a lot of the communities, boards, the town councils, city councils, and that. So that is the reason behind it, and it's pretty straightforward. Even numbers would start at 2024, odd numbers would start 4-year cycle at 2026. With that, I'll take any questions that may arise.
Any questions for Representative Phillips? Very good.
Okay, and then we'll go to House Bill 5742. And this, again, is something that a lot of states have. I believe there's between 18 and 20 states that already have this, where the governor and lieutenant governor run on the general election ballot only as a team. So that way we have some consistency, we have somebody that knows everything that's going on as a lieutenant governor, as well as the governor. And if something happens to the governor, the lieutenant governor can just keep the smooth flow of legislation in the state running from that. And with that, that's House Bill 5742.
Any questions for Representative Phillips? No. All right, that will conclude.
Pretty simple. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Absolutely, thank you. Representative Nardone, do you want your presence and vote recorded? Yes. In the affirmative? Next, we'll move to 2 bills from Representative Lombardi, House Bill 5591 and House Resolution 5022. Representative Lombardi is available via WebEx. Welcome, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, and thank you for hearing me earlier. I do have another commitment and some other bills later. I will try and be as brief as possible. We'll start with 5591. And what this act does is simply establishes rules and procedures for licensing emergency shelters, including setting minimum standards and prohibiting the charging of fees to the residents. As we all know, homelessness is at an all-time high due to COVID and the circumstances surrounding that. Very often it affects the low affluent, lesser affluent areas, which affects minorities, people of color, single parents. All they're looking to do, like anyone else, is have a roof over their head, food for their family, and a decent job. The social programs are shutting down, so the need for emergency shelters and homelessness is certainly beyond our control in many instances. So this would just simply, we would be at least codifying some rules and regulations that would not let anyone be a predator on a family or anybody who is in need of emergency shelter. And with that, I will try to endeavor to answer questions. I don't believe there's any questions. I don't believe there's anyone's going to testify, but that's my understanding.
Any questions for Representative Lombardi? No questions, Representative. You're correct. We'll move on to
so I think
your next
the
bill.
next bill is bill number 5022. And what that bill does is based on Providence. It would create 3 4-year terms. It's been constitutionally tested. It did pass constitutional muster. And it would create, as I indicated, 3 4-year terms beginning in 2024, I believe. And that would give you, 14 years as a state representative. That would address the issue that Representative Phillips talked about, every year, then, you need to take a year campaigning. But, we should be campaigning every day, every minute. But this would give us 4 years. And this does not preclude you from running for senator. It does not preclude you from running for governor, lieutenant governor, general treasurer, secretary of state. So, and I also understand that there's another bill that you will be hearing later from Representative Fenton Fong with regard to 5 2-year terms. So this is a bill I put in every year. And again, it's not being done in a vacuum. It's being done based on what happened, what we did in Providence. And again, it has been tested constitutionally. Change is good sometimes. It would change certainly leadership. It would change, different chairs, different committees. So as you can see, I've tried to be consistent. I'm calling for this. I've also called for term limits on as committee chairs and leadership. So if there's any questions, if not, I want to thank everyone for their indulgences and their time. I know everyone's busy these days. Thank you so much.
Any questions for Representative Lombardi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. That will conclude testimony on 5591 and 5022. Next